was not ravaging in Eastern Europe, he led 15 trips to the former Soviet Union. We are grateful to Phyllis Katz, our resident, for bringing Michael to us. He is her son-in-law. We present Michael to you, who is to discuss why Russia and Ukraine are at war. Let us welcome Michael White.
Thank you, Barbara. Really happy to be here and thankful for the invitation, and to my mother-in-law Phyllis for coming up with the idea. She's got lots of good ideas, and I find that usually when we say let's do it, it turns into something good, so thank you. And I did want to mention first as a disclaimer, and Barbara, I think you did a good job of giving my background, that I'm not a politics guy. I don't have students sometimes ask me, what's Putin thinking? Is he really sick? Why hasn't he been in public lately? What's going on behind the scenes in the Kremlin? I don't know. I don't have any, I'm not a political observer or a criminologist, but in years of study and travel to the former Soviet Union, I think I've learned a lot about Russian history and culture, obviously, but the reason this presentation came to be was that when Russia invaded Ukraine, my students at Maggie Walker they're a particularly gifted and sort of cosmopolitan group of students who are very interested in what's going on in the world and have a keen sense of justice. And so when they saw one European country invading another, they were concerned and didn't understand it. And so I came up with this presentation to try to explain it to them, and I'll do my best today. So just a quick bit of background, if I can. Russians and Ukrainians speak Slavic languages. The Russian and Ukrainian, of course, are Slavic languages, and Slavic languages are Indo-European languages, and Slavic cultures are Indo-European cultures, which means they're related to Germanic cultures and Germanic languages like English and German, Romance languages, and so on. So it's a big, we're all part of one big language and cultural
You're not coming
tree.
through. Just step back one little step.
Okay.
Not, we're closer.
All right.
You're not coming through.
Okay. How's this? Is this better?
No.
No. Is this better? Okay. How's that? Okay. All right. So the Slavic cultures are Indo-European cultures, and the original Slavs came from Central Europe about 1,500 years ago into what's now sort of Ukraine, southwestern Russia, which is part of what makes this all so fascinating, is that you could sort of trace the causes of this war, if you want, back that far. But the original Slavs, in a way, the original Slavs came from Central Europe into, again, what's now South Ukraine and southwestern Russia about 1,500 years ago, and then eventually moved north a little bit later to occupy what we would consider now like Western Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, a bit of the Baltic states. And so eventually the Slavs sort of subdivided into three groups: the East Slavs, the South Slavs, and the West Slavs. The East Slavs include Russians and Ukrainians. They tend to be Orthodox Christians, whereas the West Slavs tend to be Catholic, and the South Slavs Orthodox, but also some Catholic and Protestants. And I'm generalizing, but the point of this is that Russians and Ukrainians really do have a lot in common. They are East Slavs and share a lot linguistically and culturally, as we'll discover. So the early years of what we might call early Russia or Rus started, in the period that I was telling you about. But eventually, these Slavic principalities evolved in, again, what's now sort of western, southwestern Russia and Ukraine. But some Varangians or Scandinavians moved into what's now like northwestern Russia, St. Petersburg area, and eventually the story goes that the Russian princes were constantly squabbling with one another, and they invited a Varangian prince to come rule over them. I don't know a whole lot about history, but I've never really found an example in history of people inviting foreigners to come rule over them. So this sounds like maybe this is something the Varangians told later to the Slavs, when the Slavs wondered, why are you ruling us? So it's a good story. It's probably some good early PR. But the Varangians, for whatever reason, the Scandinavians did come and rule over the Slavs, but then the cultures really merged. So that's why there are a lot of Russians, for example, whose name, like Olga and Igor, a lot of Oleg. These are Scandinavian names that came into the Slavic cultures through this merger. But eventually, these princes formed sort of a confederation of principalities by the late 9th century. And the center of that power was Kiev, which is now the capital of Ukraine. And then this area became known as Rus, which is where we get the name Russia, and nobody really knows where this term came from. It could have been a Finnish name for Swedes, which would sort of make sense because pre-Swedes sort of came into this area. It could be a Scandinavian name for the Slavs. It could be an ancient name for the River Volga. Nobody really knows the source of this name. But either way, whatever way it happened, this area became known as Rus, and then that's why now we have Russians. That's where they get their name. So once these principalities sort of formed this confederation, based in Kiev, it grew and became more powerful and wealthy. A lot of river trade up and down the Dnieper and Dniester rivers, and the Don River and the Volga River. And Kiev, of course, became sort of, maybe not a capital, but the center of trade and wealth and culture. That was really important because in 988, the Grand Prince Vladimir took Christianity for all of Rus. So he Christianized Russia, choosing Orthodox Christianity as opposed to, say, Catholicism. He also considered Islam and Judaism, but he realized that if we choose Orthodox Christianity, we can become allies with Byzantium, which was big, powerful, based in Constantinople, a very big, powerful, wealthy empire, and that would be great to have those friends there. So Vladimir took Christianity for Rus. And then this began really the golden age of the power and wealth of Kiev and Rus. So for about 300 years, again, Kiev, the center of trade and culture, wealth, political power, and so on. And you can see it stretched all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea. So this is a pretty big area. A lot of river trade, and even connected to the Silk Road trade, east-west. So going as far as China, India, Persia, into Europe. I mean, they were really sort of at a crossroads of intercontinental trade. It was really a great place to be. And so things were going well until, in the 13th century, the Mongols invaded. And the Mongols, of course, Genghis Khan and his sons and grandsons came from Central Asia, and they destroyed Kiev. They showed up and said, look, we're going to kill you all and destroy your city. You can avoid that if you pay us tribute. And the people of Kiev said, no, of course we're going to fight, and here's where you can take your proposal. And the Mongols destroyed Kiev, so they were good for their word. But other cities like Moscow and Novgorod saw what had happened and realized, look, the Mongols aren't here to convert us to their religion or establish sort of a coherent empire. Like the Romans, for example, expanded and tried to make Rome bigger and bigger and have people adopt their values. The Mongols were really in it just for plunder. And so the Muscovites realized this, and they were willing to pay the tribute, and so they survived Mongol occupation without being destroyed and without being slaughtered. So this is important for our purposes because the Mongol occupation of this region really cut Russia off from the West in a lot of ways. So before then, Russia had been, again, engaged in all the early Russia, had been engaged in so much intercontinental trade and was connected with the West in a lot of ways and other parts of the world. But once the Mongols came in and basically put the Slavs in sort of a deep freeze to where they were impoverished and unable to really interact meaningfully with other cultures, Russia got cut off from the West. So that means that, if you look at the time period here, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, that means Russia missed pretty much, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, like all the precursor to that, as Europe came out of the feudalism of the Middle Ages and sort of emerged into kind of the modern world and ideas of social contract theory and all kinds of things. Russia missed that because they were sort of sealed off. So that's a big thing to think about. Also because now that Rus had been effectively destroyed as a state and economic force, the Poles and Lithuanians sort of filled that void. So that's interesting, again, trying to keep our mind on our topic, the war, because eventually the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth evolved and kind of filled that void and ruled much of what is now Ukraine and southwestern Russia. You can see where Kiev and Lviv, where both are located. And so now there's this big Polish-Lithuanian Catholic state that is connected with the West, that is sort of at odds with Russia once Russia emerges from Mongol occupation. And so over time, Russia eventually absorbed a lot of this territory, but let me explain sort of why and how that happened. Because for about 150 years, once Russia emerged from Mongol domination, power in Russia was centered in Moscow, right? Because Kiev had been destroyed and the Muscovites had paid off the Mongols, and so when the Mongols were eventually kicked out, Moscow was pretty healthy and intact. Another thing to think about is that the Mongols didn't care about the Slavs' religion, and so Orthodox Christianity was allowed to survive because they weren't looking to convert people, and so Orthodoxy really kind of kept people going in a lot of ways and kept the nation together despite the foreign domination. Anyway, so once the Mongols were kicked out, Russia started looking at those lands that had been theirs, right, Kiev and what's now Ukraine, and found that they were occupied by Poland and Lithuania, and then began a series of wars of about a century and a half. This pitted sort of East versus West, Orthodoxy versus Catholicism, and then each side argued that the other side was persecuting their minorities because there were ethnic Poles in Russia, and there were ethnic Russians in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There were Catholics in Russia, and there were Orthodox Christians in Poland, Lithuania, and so each side accused the other side of persecuting their brethren, and so that created a lot of conflict, and then there were all these shifting alliances. I'm not going to get into all this, but it was basically a big sort of mixing bowl of tensions and conflicts, and that led to a lot of fighting over partly what's now Ukraine. I guess I'm going to just for the sake of time, I'll speed through this, but one thing to keep in mind are the Cossacks. You've probably heard about the Cossacks quite a bit. They're not an ethnic group. The Cossacks are a group of people who it's debated sort of who they are and where they came from, but the idea is basically that they're largely escaped serfs, peasants, people who sort of lived on the margins of society and collected in this frontier area, which is what Ukraine was because it was this borderland between Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. And Cossacks sort of developed their own frontier culture, kind of living on their own out in the hinterlands, farming and riding horses, and developed a reputation for being really good fighters. If you think about like the early United States, when they were settling the western frontier, who went out west? It was people who didn't have really comfortable lives in the East, right? It's going to be people who kind of have sort of nothing to lose, and let's go out there and see what we can do, and then they become very independent-minded and feel like, everything I've got and I've created on my own, so, they've developed their own little culture, and something like that happened with the Cossacks in Ukraine. And the Cossacks became important because when the Russians wanted to take land from the Poles and Lithuanians, they would try to get the allegiance of the Cossacks, because that's like a big sort of, independent group that if we can get them on our side, we can, take advantage of that and steal territory from the Poles and Lithuanians. But the Poles and Lithuanians tried to do the same thing, and so they're both promising the Cossacks various things, and that's a whole separate topic. But the point is that was sort of a nexus for this conflict between East and West here. In the late 18th century, of course, there was the great partitioning of Poland, and so Russia really moved into, and when I say Poland, that includes modern Ukraine. And so Russia moved into that territory and took over a lot of it and called it Little Russia or New Russia, which is why I had this slide here, and you can see this is sort of southeastern Ukraine, southwestern Russia. And then there were Polish revolts against Russian occupation after the partitions. And Russia used those revolts as an opportunity to sort of crush any kind of dissent, including ethnic minorities that maybe said, hey, we're being ruled by Russians from far away Moscow, or at the time St. Petersburg, but we don't like that because we're not like them and we want to have our own state. 19th century was a big time for nationalism as ethnic Czechs and Ukrainians and Poles and the Irish and Serbs and a lot of ethnic national groups in Europe who didn't have political power, because Europe was dominated by big empires, started to say, hey, we want to have our own nation state. So Russians or Poles should have a Poland where Poles govern themselves, and there should be a Serbia where Serbs govern themselves, and a Ukraine, and so on. Some of those worked out after World War I, and some of them didn't. A modern day example would be Kurds, right? They're a big ethnic group in a lot of countries, and a lot of them are arguing that we should have an independent Kurdish state, but we don't, and we're being persecuted everywhere we live. Anyway, that's a side note, but the point is that the Russians, to sort of crush those attempts at revolt, banned Ukrainian language in the press and in schools, and the Boryov Circular came out in 1863, which was a government proclamation in Russia that basically said, look, Ukrainian doesn't exist. It's not a language, it's not a culture, it's like a little offshoot of Russia, it's, come on, you're not a real people, was basically what the Russians are saying. This happened 150 years ago, but these days Vladimir Putin is saying pretty much the same thing, as we'll get to in a moment. Of course, World War I was a catastrophe for the Russian Empire. They had to basically surrender to the Germans, and that led to the Bolshevik Revolution, and then there was a big civil war in the new Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution. In that time, what had been Poland and Ukraine, I'm just putting Ukraine in quotes because it wasn't a state, but Ukraine, that area was all in flux, and it wasn't clear what's going to happen there. And so there was an attempt to have let's have a new Polish state, and then other people said, no, let's have a new Ukrainian government. So there was sort of a Ukrainian state briefly for a few months at this time, but eventually a treaty was signed that involved the West that created an independent Poland in sort of the ashes of World War I. And the Russians really resented this because the British and the French were involved, and they said, you're trying to create this Poland because you don't want the Soviet Union to be big and powerful, and you're trying to, kind of hem us in there, which again is what Putin is saying these days about the West and NATO, as I'll get to in a second. But anyway, so what's now Ukraine after World War I was divided, and Poland got the western half, and Russia got the Soviet Union got the eastern half. Eventually, Ukraine joined the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and so it was one of 15 republics in the Soviet Union, and that was, and as the Soviet Union matured, that became just sort of another functioning part of the Soviet Union. You can see here the 15 republics, and because the Soviet Union was a big unified country, there was still no notion of Ukraine as a separate entity, because it was just another republic. And the whole idea of the Soviet Union is that workers and peasants from all over, regardless of ethnicity, language, religious background, none of that matters because all workers and peasants are coming together to form one people. That's where you get the hammer and the sickle. The hammer are the urban workers and the sickle are the rural workers, and we're coming together for socialism. So the fact that you're Ukrainian or that person's Georgian or someone else is Estonian doesn't matter. So this notion of being Ukrainian was really quelled. Joseph Stalin was pretty tough about crushing any attempt to have sort of expression of ethnic identity, except as in sort of like a caricaturish thing. Like if you went as a tourist, they might put on a folkloric production of song or dance, and they say, look, we have Georgian culture and we have Ukrainian culture, but it was really sort of a superficial demonstration, and really Ukrainians weren't allowed to be Ukrainians. Everything was focused on being unified Soviets and speaking Russian, really. So in 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev, who was himself Ukrainian, when he proposed that let's give the Crimea, that region, the Crimean Peninsula, let's give it to, because it had been part of the Russian Republic, let's give it to the Ukrainian Republic, nobody really cared, because it's just a symbolic little thing. I mean, who cares? It's not it's not going to change anything. Everyone's still governed from Moscow. It's not a real place. It's a purely symbolic thing. So there was no resistance, but that became a really big deal later once the Soviet Union broke up. After World War II, I'm sure I don't need to explain to you the basics of the Cold War. I find increasingly with our high school students I have to. But this is important because, of course, the Soviet Union, as in the United States, developed this notion of East versus West conflict. And the Cold War was a zero-sum game where any gain by the opposite side was a loss to us. So, you know about the Iron Curtain and the Cold War and NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. And so the whole idea was that in the Soviet Union was that the West would do anything to get, territory from us. And so we have to stand really strong against that because they're a constant threat. All right, so in 1991, of course, the Soviet Union broke up, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic became Ukraine, an independent Ukraine, for the first time ever. So except for those couple of months in World War I, there really had never been an independent Ukrainian state. This was a big deal, and this is where in America, or in the English-speaking world, we had to shift from saying the Ukraine to Ukraine, because something like when you start a place name with the, it's like a perceptual region that doesn't have clear boundaries. Like if somebody's from the Middle East or the Midwest, like where is that exactly? We probably disagree on where exactly the boundaries of that are because it's a region that we perceive, but it's not like France, right? France has boundaries and it's clear you're either in France or not in France. And so that's where the came from. And there's actually an equivalent in Russian that you use a different preposition to say I'm in the Ukraine as opposed to in Spain, for example, or Italy. So, and then Ukrainian speaking Russian would insist, let's shift that preposition because now we're an independent country and don't think of us as just an area. But Russians, really, in my experience, never made that change, which for a lot of Ukrainians was kind of offensive. It's kind of funny how like a single syllable preposition can be a real stick in the eye. It can be a political statement. Anyway, so Ukraine became independent. And, all of these former Soviet republics became 15 independent countries. And the Russians were, largely speaking, I think it's safe to say, devastated. It was a shocking development. Even a year earlier, few people saw this coming. The Soviet citizens had grown up always thinking that we're the biggest, best country in the world. We've got really good education, healthcare, everyone has a job. The West is, trying to threaten us with nuclear weapons, and they would like to see us, destroyed. And, we're trying to build an ideal society for people. And now suddenly that dream is gone, and it was humiliating. They lost almost half of their population to these other countries, control of their nuclear arsenal, superpower status. It was just really, frankly, for a lot of Russians, humiliating. So let's get right to the war. Vladimir Putin, before the war and as the war started, made several arguments for why Ukraine really isn't the thing. And some of his arguments were nice. Like, hey, we're just one people, right? We all came from the Varangians who came down here and the principalities, and there was a Rus for a long time, right? That was our big golden age. And, we're really just one people. Like this East Slav, we're all East Slavs. We all came from this Varangian dynasty. We all, we took Orthodox Christianity together. Sure, there's Great Russia and Little Russia, which is Ukraine, and White Russia, which is Belarus, but we're really just all one Russia, right? We're not different. And we tend to all be Orthodox Christians, so we have that in common. Russian and Ukrainian are very, very similar. So the alphabet is almost identical. So much of the vocabulary is the same. We're the same people, right? And we've always had these economic connections. Even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, we traded a lot with one another, and a lot of people crossed borders to do business. So we're economically tied. There are a lot of like Russian-Ukrainian marriages. There's really no difference ethnically, says Putin. And this is what the people want. The people want brotherhood between Russians and Ukrainians. And when he looked at the language, he said, even if you look at the name Ukraine, Ukraina, it means like the periphery or the borderland, because Krai is like a region, and the U prefix means like out there. So it's sort of like, it's out there, it's that borderland. And that Putin said this word came to refer to the border guards who guarded that region. So look, you're not even like a separate state, right? You're just the outlands of our region. So why would you split off? That doesn't make any sense. And Russian is, Ukrainian, he said, is just a dialect of Russian. I've got the two alphabets up here, and you probably see some differences, but as you can tell, they're relatively minor. And really, Putin looked at something like Italian reunification in the 19th century, when the Italians were, for a very long time, Italy was divided into various kingdoms and principalities and city-states, and there still are, of course, a lot of regional differences among parts of Italy, but at some point, Italians decided, we have a lot of differences, but we're all Italian, and we have more in common than separates us. And an independent Italy was born in 1870, I believe. And so that's what Putin's thing was, that look, Russia and Ukraine are just like, Sicily and Rome. I mean, there are differences, but they're all Italians, and we're all Russians. Let's not even use the word Ukrainian, which is what Putin would have said. And then he said the only differences in the language are just because, like, Ukrainian is Russian ruined by Polish, basically, like he really said. Yeah, that it was the influence of Polish and Catholicism and all these foreign ideas and words and stuff that's what. So Ukrainian is like Russian that kind of went through the wash and picked up a color it shouldn't have. And he pointed out some really famous writers like Taras Shevchenko, who's sort of the Ukrainian national poet laureate, who wrote Ukrainian poetry and is a big figure for Ukrainian nationalists, but he also wrote prose in Russian. And so Putin points to that and says, look, poetry is nice, but if your prose is serious, and he's writing in Russian, so come on. And Nikolai Gogol, a famous Russian writer who was born in Ukraine but also wrote in Russian. And so this is Putin is saying, look, even the Ukrainian cultural heroes you hold up, they're really Russian. It's the same thing. So that's one of his things. And he also said, look, we're good to you. We trade with you a lot. This is before the war, of course. We're worth over $80 billion to your budget. Russia sends gas, or until recently, sent gas in these pipelines through Ukraine to Western Europe. That was a big deal in Germany when they decided we're not going to take that gas anymore. And Ukraine makes a lot of money for allowing that gas to travel through its country, and that's worth $1.5 billion a year to you. So look, we're helping you. We're all one people. This economic relationship is good for you. We're your number 3 trade partner. Why would you want to look to the West? Why would you want to be separate from us? So that's sort of the sunny side of Putin's argument. Kind of the darker side is where he says, look, just the idea that Ukraine is a thing is ludicrous. You're not a country. You're only 30 years old. You're an invention of the West. That the West, when the Soviet Union fell apart, the West was very excited, and they encouraged, the CIA sent people all over to the former republics, and they encouraged these development of independent countries and democracies that eventually would join NATO, which happened, and not in Ukraine's case, but a lot of cases. And the West saw this as an opportunity to sort of feed on our carcass as the Soviet Union fell apart, and to hem Russia in and keep encroach on us and keep us small and sort of neutered. And so Ukraine is just an invention of the West, really. It's not a real state, and the Soviet Union its breakup was a tragedy. Putin says, he said it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. It was the breakup of the Soviet Union. Think about maybe some other candidates for that distinction, but he really saw it as just a real tragedy, and the separating of Russia and Ukraine is like, pulling apart siblings and not allowing them to be together. They need to be together. He also accused the Ukrainians of committing ethnic cleansing against ethnic Russians who were in Ukraine. He says that Russians are being rounded up and killed. Orthodox Christians and Russian Orthodox in particular are being persecuted. And I didn't get into that, but there was actually sort of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church at one point sort of separated from Moscow and created its own church, sort of in terms of the political running of the churches. So anyway, he saw the Ukrainians as being is persecuting Russian Orthodox Christians, and the West hates Russia and just wants to take every opportunity to exploit it. And if we can put a friendly guy in the presidency of Ukraine, then that will allow us to keep Russia hemmed in. And basically, Ukraine is a failed state. It's not going well for you people. So he looked at these artificial borders and he said, look, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks drew Ukraine's borders. Borders, as I pointed out earlier, didn't mean anything in the Soviet Union. And there was never a Ukrainian state before 1991. And he says, look, the modern Ukraine is just a fiction. And I mean, this I think sounds to me as an American crazy, but I can tell you I've talked to numerous Russians of various educational backgrounds, and it's really hard for me to find a Russian in Russia who disagrees with this. Like, people tend to largely agree, or people who don't agree, it's dangerous to speak out. I was shocked to find a couple of friends whose intelligence and education I have a lot of respect for completely agree with this stuff and say, yeah, of course Ukraine, that's not a thing, you guys just made that up, it should be one country. So that point of view has a lot of support, I think, broadly in Russia. Another point by Putin was that the Soviet Union's breakup was traumatic, as I pointed out, and that ethnic Russians, it's a little bit like, not quite, but it's a little bit like, after World War I, the German Empire broke up, and that left ethnic Germans in these other new countries, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere in Europe, and then of course that was part of Hitler's big campaign, is we need to reconstitute, the fatherland, and let's bring home, Germans to have a bigger, broader Germany, because those ethnic Germans are being persecuted in those countries. Putin was saying something very similar about ethnic Russians in these new post-Soviet states. And then he sees these new post-Soviet states joining the European Union and joining NATO, and look, this is just another example of the West trying to get them in their clutches to encroach upon Russian power and wealth and keep us hemmed in. And they're plundering our natural resources, and the West really delighted in the breakup of the Soviet Union. And looking at the Russians oppressed in Ukraine, he looked at how Ukrainian is the official language of the Ukrainian government, of schools, of print media, and he said, look, you've got a lot of Russian speakers and they're being linguistically oppressed. They're not allowed to use their language. He also made up a lot of stuff about Russians not being able to use Russian in school, which there doesn't seem to be much evidence for that, but he created all of this big made a big stink about purported ethnic cleansing against Russians in Ukraine. And then for Putin, of course, the West is always plotting against Russia. If you go back to Poland and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, you see a lot of examples of the West plotting against Russia, and that Ukrainian nationalism was just an invention, and it's not a real thing. And then, of course, after the Cold War, he points to the United States and NATO and the European Union and says, all you've been doing is trying to threaten and isolate Russia, and you guys just want to control NATO. And Ukraine is a failed state. You got a lousy economy. If it weren't for us being Russia, you wouldn't have a good economy at all. Your industry is down, your GDP is down, there's a lot of corruption in your government, which is true. Ukraine has had some trouble with that. And also he's made a big stink about this having to denazify Ukraine, and alleging that the Ukrainian government is a bunch of American-controlled Nazis who are trying to ethnically cleanse Russians. It's hard to follow, but that's his argument, and so Ukraine is a failed state. All right, so just a little bit of history before I get to the war. In 2004 and 5, Ukraine went through the Orange Revolution, which is where there was a presidential election and then widespread claims of corruption and vote rigging that led to these massive demonstrations that, I don't know if you remember the Orange Revolution, everyone wore these orange scarves and waved these orange signs as a symbol of, it was really part of the color revolution, that swept Ukraine, Georgia, and some other states. Anyway, so they had a second vote, and sort of the good guy won. And so the domestic observers said, great, you guys cleaned it up, your second election was a lot better, and Putin said, this is an example of the West coming in and playing with the system to try to make it come out the way they want. Because Yushchenko, who's on the bottom here, who won the second election, was friendly to the West and was fairly liberal, and Yanukovych, who's on the top, was very friendly to Russia and was a bit of an autocrat. So Putin says, look, this is an example of the West manipulating Ukrainian politics to try to make sure that Ukraine is not allied with Russia at all. In 2014, you may have heard of the revolution on the Maidan, which is a big square in Kiev. Basically, Ukraine was moving towards a free trade deal with the EU and a political connections deal that looked like it might move toward joining the EU at some point. And Vladimir Putin was furious about this. And so he, and even though it was a very popular idea within Ukraine, at the last minute the president didn't sign the agreement. And the notion publicly was that, well, that's because Russia pressured him into refusing to sign. There were massive demonstrations. Government officials, government snipers actually shot and killed numerous protesters. And the president, who was Yanukovych, who lost the previous election, it gets confusing. But anyway, he fled to Russia, and a new president came in and signed the deal with the West. And Russia was furious and said, look, it's a coup. The duly elected president had to flee because of these demonstrations, and this new guy is just trying to, make Ukraine just supposed to be a lapdog of the West. So anyway, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected in 2019, and is president now, of course, and this led to what we've seen. So in 2014, Russia moved into eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. This is where you heard about the little green men, these soldiers who showed up in unmarked uniforms. And then they pushed through very quickly this referendum where the people of Crimea voted to join Russia by a 97% vote. And so, it's amazing. And anyway, and Russia also sent troops into Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, as you can see, and that's where that's where a lot of the fighting is happening now. And Ukraine's hoping to get that territory back. But anyway, so this all started 9 years ago. Russia basically occupying Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk. I'll tell you that I went to Russia in 2015, 16, and 19, and they started publishing on posters and places like new maps of Russia that showed eastern Ukraine and Crimea as being Russian. They made new notes of currency, and it was like, oh, this note is devoted to Crimea, which is ours, of course. And we went to a thing that had us to go through a virtual reality thing, like we're flying on a plane all over Russia, and it made a big thing about Crimea. There was a big section in there where you're flying over Crimea, which is Russia. Anyway, so very quickly that became a big propaganda tool. There was a point in 2014-15 where there was a potential deal to end this conflict in eastern Ukraine, but it wasn't implemented, and Ukraine didn't like the deal, and they thought that they were being bullied, and they didn't want to lose their territory that had been taken by Russia. So those deals fell apart, and then in 2022, as you know, this special military operation began, and Russia issued passports to the people living in Luhansk and Donetsk and the regions that they had taken over, to say that, look, you're now Russian citizens. And so, just to basically sort of make it a sort of a fait accompli that this is Russian territory. And they recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent states, and they said that now this is Russian territory, which means that if Ukraine were to advance into that territory, now Russia could claim that, look, now you're invading Russia, right? And so that's a pretty good PR move. Russia invaded, of course, Ukraine, as you know, from the northeast and south about 13 months ago, and the West instituted sweeping sanctions. And just to take you very quickly through what's happened lately, that the Russians got very quickly to the outskirts of Kiev, and then they got bogged down and were forced back. But there's still an enormous amount of fighting in the sort of northeast, east, and southeast. And I think I've heard that since New Year's, the Russians have gained 0.01% of the territory that they held at the end of 2022. So they're not really making any progress, although they recently did take sort of a key city. But they're not making much progress territorially. But of course, the war is continuing. You know about the mass graves in Bucha. Russia has taken Mariupol. This guy here pictured in the center, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is a businessman who's cozy with Putin, and he started sort of a paramilitary group called the Wagner Group that fought to help support Russia's aims in Syria and here in Ukraine, and has been sort of, so they're, anything that they do, the Russians can plausibly say, well, those aren't our soldiers. But Prigozhin, of course, has been going around to prisons and recruiting prisoners to go fight. And basically saying, you're in for 20 years, but if you come fight for us for 6 months, you're done. You don't have to go back to prison. But a lot of those people are being sent forward with minimal training or equipment, just basically as cannon fodder. So Russia in September annexed 4 regions through illegal referenda and sort of nominally claimed these are now officially parts of Russia. And the war has killed over 130,000 Ukrainians, over 200,000 Russians, and to date the United States has given about $33 billion in aid. But Joe Biden has said we're never going to send troops, we're not going to get directly involved. But we and the Germans and the Poles, lately have been sending tanks and sort of stepping up our support of Ukraine in a lot of ways. So I don't know where we're going from here, but when this war happened, I was really just, I came up with this presentation because my students had questions, but also because I was really upset. Like, it just was saying crazy to me that Russia would invade Ukraine. It's like, to me, it just didn't make any sense. And just the scale of devastation is so distressing, particularly when you think about what really should bind these people, not as one state, but as as brethren. They certainly have more in common than separates them. But so it was just so upsetting to me that I kind of felt like I had to do something, and this is the least I could do. So anyway, there's a lot more I'd like to say, but I want to leave time for some questions, so I'm happy to entertain any questions you have.
We have 2 women with microphones. Please raise your hand, and either Sylvia Fine or Denise Bakula will come to you. Thank you.
Do you have, or could you share with us your opinion of Secretary Blinken and the things that he's leading and has been leading?
Well, again, I'm not really a politics guy, but I'm glad that the United States is supporting Ukraine, and I'd like to see more aid. And I don't know, frankly, I'd like to see us sort of fast track the incorporation of Ukraine into the EU and NATO, just because I feel like if there's one thing that international organizations should stand for, it's the respect of sovereignty of territories. And I realize that that's Putin's claim, that he's saying that's our territory, but I just feel like, like when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the world responded, and there was this huge coalition that said that's intolerable. And I feel like even though people are afraid of nuclear weapons, which is a serious concern, I just think that ultimately we're kind of giving Putin too much credit, and that we should think. I mean, we're as powerful. I mean, we with the European Union, I think, are more powerful than the Russian military, and I think we need to sort of stand strong for Ukraine's territorial integrity, personally, and to continue to pursue these war crimes investigations. I know Putin was recently, a warrant was issued for his arrest. That's why he was unable to be here today, so I apologize. But yeah, I like our support, and but I'd like to see it strengthened. I'm not saying we should send troops, but I'd like to see it as close to that as we can get.
I just have a quick question myself. What are your feelings about the participation and support of the other NATO countries so far?
I think Germany's done a tremendous amount, and the British as well. A lot of hardware, but also a lot of intelligence. But I don't know. I'd kind of like to see a no-fly zone personally, but I'm not a policy guy, so that maybe that's wouldn't be the smartest thing. But I just think this is the kind of thing where the United States and the European nations standing together make a coalition that you know, we haven't seen Putin ever do this, but I actually think he'd probably eventually back down from and try to find a way to save face. But that's why I was not elected to any positions. Probably shouldn't be in office.
I've read somewhere that Stalin, before World War II and during the war, completely drained Ukraine of crops, and the economy went south terribly badly.
Yeah.
And some of the Ukrainian people welcomed the Nazis because they thought they would be treated better than Stalin was treating them. Is that true?
Yeah, that's a good point that I kind of glossed over, but should probably mention in more detail here. That you're right. So because of all that history of Poland and Lithuania fighting over Ukraine with Russia, there was this long-standing suspicion in Russia that the people living in what's now Ukraine are not maybe sufficiently loyal, and like we can't really trust them. And so that was part of Joseph Stalin's thing, was that he didn't really trust those people because, you know, this collectivization was in the 1930s. In like the teens and 20s, there were Ukrainian nationalists fighting for an independent state, and there were Poles trying to create an independent Poland, which of course happened. But he didn't really trust a lot of people living in those regions. And so the Holodomor, sort of the famine in Ukraine in the 30s, was partly through the disaster of collectivization of farms, but also partly intentional to let's weaken the people in that area, to weaken their resistance. And yes, it's true that a lot of people in Ukraine were so exploited and devastated by Soviet collectivization and the Soviet regime that when the Nazis invaded, there were significant groups of people who were happy to see the Nazis come because, well, it can't be worse than this, so let's help those people out. And then initially the Germans did sort of say, okay, great, Ukrainians, you can govern yourselves. They developed these local councils and so on, so they gave them this notion of self-government and autonomy that was a sham. It didn't last long, but that gave some Ukrainians hope that, oh, we are going to be liberated, and then of course they weren't. But during collectivization, I was just reading about how there were plenty of resources to feed the people in Ukraine, and Stalin deliberately withheld them because he wanted to weaken resistance and opposition in Ukraine. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I was interested in the language thing you pointed out about Ukraine versus the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I also remember a time when it was referred to as Ukrainia. Now, is that just slang, or where does that fit in?
Well, that's just sort of an older verb. So the Russian word for Ukraine is Ukraina, which is also Ukrainian. The Ukrainia was an older, it's an older term, but that's closer to the Russian sort of Slavic original. You could really offend a Ukrainian by using the wrong preposition. So you have to be careful. Okay, what?
There's some discussion that this whole affair might end up with Putin falling. Is that just a myth in your opinion? What would it take to bring down Putin in Russia?
Again, I don't have an insider in the Kremlin, but I'm working on one. But he's not returning my calls. But I don't know, but I would think it would have to be some internal coup. And as bad as things are, I'm not sure that would be better, because there are people in the government and oligarchs and so on who are upset that Putin isn't doing more. They're like, why is this war taking so long? Why are so many Russians dying? We should just be destroying them, right? We have a much more powerful military, and the West is afraid to do anything, so come on. So I would think it would probably be some kind of coup, because Putin's got such control over the media, and people can't demonstrate, and anybody who mentions the war as a war, it's being thrown in prison. You can go to jail for 10 years for using the word war in Russia. So I would be shocked if there was a popular uprising, but I was also shocked when the Berlin Wall came down. So I'm Also, you should see my NCAA tournament bracket. I'm very bad at predicting the future.
Do you anticipate any significant?
Go ahead, John.
Hello, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it before. Do you anticipate any significant changes in Russia as a result of the visit of the Chinese emperor himself? They must have done some serious consideration of what would be best in the interest of both of them.
Yeah. Again, I regret that I never took Chinese and didn't learn much about Chinese politics, but I think that Russia's kind of watching this very carefully because I think maybe they're seeing Ukraine is to Russia as Taiwan is to China. And let's see what happens to Putin and let's see what the West does, because that could tell us what the West is willing to do if we, did something, made a move on Taiwan, which sort of like Putin, the Chinese have always claimed, that's really ours. There's really just one China. So I think this is a pretty good indicator of what Xi Jinping would decide to do with Taiwan. And he is, I think, providing some help to Putin, but almost none. Just because that would be seen as kind of provocative, and could really harm China economically. So who knows? But I think that is an important consideration. So,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Not entirely relevant to Ukraine, but do you know anything about what's happening to Navalny?
To Navalny?
Yeah.
Last I heard, he's in a labor camp in
Is he alive?
Siberia somewhere.
Is he alive?
I haven't heard otherwise. I don't know. But I was shocked that he returned to Russia because you could have predicted he was going to be arrested. So that's not known.
Question, or actually 3 comments. Number one, I want to thank you for your extensive research. I think it was excellent. As part of your research, do you find any particular reason why you picked this time to invade? And the third part is, and this is old hat from some of the folks here, I'd still like to recommend the Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, who helps explain a lot of why we do the things that we do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've read 2 really good books recently. One is called Borderland by Anna Reid, she also wrote a terrific book about the siege of Leningrad, and also there's a book by Robert Braithwaite that gives, in about 250 pages, a sweeping look of Russian history. But I'm sorry, I don't remember your previous question, but Barbara?
One more question.
Oh, sorry.
I had one question, sort of to do. We had the opportunity to visit Ukraine in 2008, spent a week going up the Dnieper River. And it seemed that the people on the east side of the Dnieper River seemed to gravitate more and have more interest in Moscow. The people on the west side very much for the east and joining the EU. Do you think that the possible solution ends up that another state is formed for those people in Ukraine that do orient themselves more to Russia than they do to the West?
I imagine that's possible, but I don't think Putin would be happy with that. I think he really either wants to sort of gobble up Ukraine or just make sure there's a puppet president, sort of. But you're right, that there is a big East-West divide in Ukraine, and the West is more Western-looking historically, the East is more Eastern-looking. But I'll say, just if I could leave you with this, that, I have been to Russia many times over the last 30-plus years, and despite all this rhetoric coming out from Russia and Putin demonizing the West and all this stuff, really, all of my interactions with real Russians on a real personal level, they love the United States. They're always really excited to meet Americans. They're enormously generous and kind and welcoming, and I feel like when I go to Russia or talk with Russians, the political stuff is you know, kind of far away, and let's, you know, we don't have to see each other as politicians, because most of us are not, and I find that when Russians and Americans are able to connect, and I see this with my students all the time, they form these really meaningful relationships, and the fact that Putin doesn't like what Obama did and Ukraine and Joe Biden, like that, none of that matters on a real personal level. So that's something that gives me hope for the future, eventually, hopefully. But unfortunately, politics are preventing that kind of connection, because I can't take students there, and we can't travel there, and they can't travel here, and it seems to me this none of this stuff will ever be resolved until we can really, you know, connect again as people. So that's my basic feeling on that.
Barbara, we got one more question.
I'll also stick around after if you have other questions. So.
Thank you. Following up on John Taylor's question relative to Stalin, was that the genesis of the Ukrainians' intense desire for freedom?
I mean, I think there's always been, like going back to the Cossacks into the 17th century, there's always been an element of Ukrainian people wanting more autonomy, especially since they were in kind of a borderland territory. You know, if you think about the United States and like where, I don't know, like if you ever think about sort of extreme libertarians maybe, or sort of like, remember in Idaho there was that, like separatist people seem to be kind of out in the frontier, right? They seem to, because they want to go and be on their own and be autonomous and do their own thing. So I think that's been going on for an awfully long time. And I do think Ukrainians see a lot of common cause, a lot of connections to Russians, but they also historically have not wanted to be ruled from Moscow, from far away, particularly when, like you said, about East-West, especially when Western Ukrainians have been always more connected with Poland and Germany and Austria and the West. The idea of being ruled from far away to the East to a lot of people seemed unappetizing. So that's what I'd say about that.
I want to put in a plug for next month's speaker. Dr. Jack Lanier will be discussing the symptoms of the heart attack and the differences between men and women. Today, we are very grateful to Michael White for coming and joining with us with this new information. And he is willing to stay a few moments if you wish to talk with him personally. Thank you. Have a great day.